In the Spanish-speaking world, the most renowned and prestigious daily newspaper is El Pais. Published in Madrid, it has around 320,000 print readers and a reported 7 million online. Its influence extends far beyond Spain. It prints a Latin American edition and in 2013 started a version of the paper in Portuguese for the Brazilian market. Even though Latin Americans have plenty of their own newspapers to read, El Pais carries a lot of ideological weight. Politicians, businessmen, writers and intellectuals from across the region pay attention to its coverage and try to get published in its pages or write for its cultural supplement. Small wonder then that in 2007, its front page started carrying the boastful tagline, "The Global Paper" in Spanish. Its status comes, I think, from a combination of three main factors. One is the range of its coverage and quality of its reporting. In media landscapes dominated by tabloid sensationalism, it has a sober, serious tone, and most of the time adopts an air of stolid objectivity. Another important factor is its reputation as a bulwark of democracy. The paper was established in May 1976, shortly after the death of Franco, and played a key role in shaping public debates during Spain's transition from dictatorship to democracy. It was a staunch supporter of the negotiated constitution of 1978 and came out strongly against the attempted coup by an ex-Francoist junta in February 1981, publishing a special issue calling for respect for the constitution. From the start, it was very deferential to the monarchy, as witnessed this unctuous 1993 tribute to Juan de Borbón, who didn't even get to be king. It was also hostile to anything that might threaten the post-Franco settlement, such as Basque and Catalan national aspirations. What all this means is that El País is closely identified with the democratic system that took shape in Spain after Franco, rather than, say, being aligned with the church or the workers' movement or with any strong ideological traditions. For that reason, since the early 1980s, El País has overwhelmingly supported the party that offered the best guarantee of preserving that system, the centre-left PSOE, the Partido Socialista Obrero Español, led by Felipe González, who was Spain's prime minister from 1982 to 1996. This brings us to the third factor in El País's global status. The newspaper is part of a massive multimedia conglomerate, the Grupo Prisa, which has interests across the realms of print, radio, TV, publishing, music and entertainment in 22 countries. Politically, this behemoth has also been tightly, incestuously connected with the PSOE. Critics have in fact accused the group of being the media arm of the party and of having government help in securing favourable legislation on a number of its business dealings. The long-standing personal links between the group's founder, Jesus Polanco, and Prime Minister González led many in Spain to wonder whether this might have had any effect on El País's coverage. Criticisms of the PSOE were thin on the ground during González's decade and a half in charge, and the numerous corruption scandals that tainted Felipismo in the early 1990s were pursued much more doggedly by the paper's centre-right rival, El Mundo. This reticence wasn't a matter of slavish deference to the authorities. On the contrary, El País's power over the PSOE government was common knowledge. One high functionary of the party itself apparently once admitted that it's not El País that's with the PSOE, it's the PSOE that's with El País. The Grupo Prisa was one of a number of Spanish conglomerates that expanded massively into Latin America in the 1980s and 90s, the era of widespread privatizations across much of the region, energetically promoted by the neoliberal prophets of the Washington Consensus. Spanish capital was among the main beneficiaries of this wave of sell-offs, with banks, construction firms and media moguls hoovering up assets in one country after another, a process that many dubbed a reconquista, a Spanish economic reconquest, taking place 2 centuries after these countries had secured their independence from it. El País, the flagship of Prisa's media empire, was of course one of the main cheerleaders of this expansion. But perhaps the most important job it has done for Spanish and global capital has been to defend private interests against radical challenges, and once again, Latin America has been a key battleground. Here, El País's credentials as a supporter of democracy in 1970s Spain are a vital asset. When it speaks of the perils of dictatorship, it supposedly knows what it's talking about. Closeness to Latin America's political lexicon also helps. Where English language papers complain about the dangers of populism, El País also uses the term caudillo to refer to leaders it doesn't like. This rhetoric is plastered all over the paper on a regular basis. Nobel Literature Prize winner Mario Vargas Llosa and Mexican intellectual Enrique Krause are just 2 of the large number of Latin Americans who have written along similar lines in the pages of El País. So insistent is this ideological drumbeat, in fact, that in 2012 the Argentine journalist Daniel Plotkin was able to draw up a helpful list of instructions for Latin American writers hoping to publish an opinion piece in El País. Item 1. The whole of your analysis should be based on the concepts of caudillismo and populism. Ultimately, these concepts explain the history of Latin America since the 19th century, without having to enter into historical complexities which will just bore your readers. Number 2. Mention poverty and hunger, but but only as products of caudillismo and populism. For God's sake, don't bring up colonialism or slavery. Mention corruption too, but only as a product of caudillismo and populism. Another useful tip to remember is that Latin America is apparently still in the middle of a democratic transition, whereas Spain has long since completed the process thanks to the maturity of its society and ruling class, who were able to leave caudillismo and populism behind. The term caudillo evokes the spectre of right-wing strongmen such as Franco, Perón, and Pinochet, as well as any number of 19th century tyrants. But these days, El Pais only uses it as a label for left-wing, democratically elected governments, a really brazen piece of ideological manipulation. Perhaps the most characteristic example of this came in an editorial from 2007 on the 40th anniversary of Che Guevara's death, which unsubtly glued together the paper's bogeymen of left and right. It was titled simply Caudillo Guevara. This was an appallingly tendentious attack on Che as a totalitarian, a militaristic precursor of modern-day jihadis. Luckily, said El Pais, the Latin American left had long since shaken off his socialist ideology and fanatical methods. The only regrettable exceptions were Cuba and the Bolivarian countries, and something really had to be done about them. Another very striking feature of El Pais over the last decade or so, apart from its manic obsession with caudillismo, has been its virulent hatred for Chavez. Some of this may be because the PSOE governments of Spain were intimately entangled with the old regime Chavez displaced, and in particular with Carlos Andrés Pérez, president of Venezuela in the 1970s and again from 1989 to 1993. Chavez's arrival didn't just remove friends and allies, however, it posed a real threat to Spain's business interests in the region, and the longer he remained in power, the more troubling he became. El Pais consistently leapt to the defense of what it called democracy and free speech in Venezuela, which really meant the defense of the oligarchy and private media barons. Indeed, for all El Pais's claims to be a champion of democracy and constitutionalism, when it comes down to it, these things are strictly secondary. No case better illustrates this than its reaction to the attempted coup against Chavez in April 2002. Did it now leap to the defense of a popularly elected leader? Hardly. El Pais immediately published a triumphant editorial titled "A Coup Against a Caudillo." In El Pais's Through the Looking Glass world, what had happened was a popular upsurge against a tyrant. Quote, "The army, spurred on by the street, has put an end to the dream of a rhetorical Bolivarian revolution, led by a former coup plotter who won elections legitimately in order to turn himself, once in power, into an autocrat who was a danger to his country and the rest of the world." Chavez may have won a few elections, but El Pais readers were instructed not to mistake a broad popular mandate for real democracy. Democracy, it said, is not just a matter of votes, but also of customs. And of course, Spain, a country with a long history of dictatorship, which to this day has a hereditary monarchy, is well placed to lecture Latin Americans about the habits and traditions of real democracy. In November 2007, at the Ibero-American Summit in Chile, Chavez denounced Spain's support for the attempted coup against him 5 years earlier. Famously, the King of Spain, full of aristocratic irritation at a mere elected politician from the colonies, told Chavez to shut up. El Pais went big on the story. Even a week later, it still dominated the paper's front page, appearing 3 times. Such was El Pais's desire to diminish Chavez. If they couldn't actually help topple him in practice, they could do a lot of work on the symbolic front, that they were desperate for bad news about his health in his final months. So desperate, in fact, that they published a photo of a completely different person looking very ill. Yes, in January of 2013, the front page of El Pais was dominated by a photo purporting to show Chavez on his sickbed. Indeed, this is far from the only time El Pais has set aside reality in favor of dogma. Spanish journalist and media expert Pascual Serrano has made a point of documenting its distortions over the years. To borrow just a couple of his examples, in 2009, El Pais painted a bleak picture of Bolivia's economy, saying gas exports were collapsing, growth slowing down, and the government deficit rising, whereas GDP was actually rising by 3 to 4%, gas revenues were steadily increasing, and government finances were generally in decent shape. Serrano also points out another example of outright falsehood. In 2007, El Pais published a photo of a gathering in La Paz, claiming the people there were opponents of the government, whereas in fact they were demonstrating in support of the government. So unconcerned is El Pais with getting the facts straight that it hasn't even corrected the error properly. Visitors to their website can see the same picture, now with the heading "Supporters of Evo Morales," but with a caption underneath that describes them as opponents of Evo Morales. El Pais began its life bearing the slogan, "The Independent Morning Daily." By the mid-2000s, though, its close intertwinement with the PSOE and with the commercial interests of the Grupo Prisa had put paid to the myth of editorial independence. And besides, it now had a worldwide media empire to think about. This is doubtless why, in October 2007, it announced it was changing the slogan to the Global Spanish Language Newspaper. The timing was perhaps a little hubristic. It coincided, of course, with the onset of the global economic crisis, which would have an especially severe impact on Spain. Amid the ravages of austerity and unemployment that have struck the country, El Pais and its parent company have not been immune. Between 2007 and 2008, the Grupo Prisa lost almost 4/5 of its stock market value, and in 2010, its owners, the Polanco family, were obliged to sell their majority stake to American investors. Still, the paper continued to lose readers and money, and in 2012 it announced that it would be laying off almost 1/3 of its staff, a huge reduction unrivaled in most other major news organizations. In this context, it's perhaps not surprising that the paper has devoted a lot of attention to the crisis. But this doesn't mean it's revised any of its basic assumptions about Spain's whole political and economic model. As support drains from the PSOE and the main centre-right party, El Pais remains hostile to any attempts to think outside the boundaries. It notably went on the attack against the new left party, Podemos, which got 8% in the 2014 European elections, trying to claim it had indirectly received money from the Chavez government, which obviously makes them mini caudillos of some kind. Even now, as the country's constitutional setup is being urgently questioned, with Catalans pushing for greater autonomy or independence, and hundreds of thousands of Spaniards demanding an end to the monarchy, El Pais remains chained to the pillars of the 1978 settlement. It had previously fawned over Prince Felipe. Now, on his coronation as Felipe VI, it published diagrams specifying what the new monarch would wear: white gloves, blue trousers, a silk sash, a hat. This was real news. The weirdly obsessive detail points to an almost erotic kind of fetishization of the autocrat or great leader. One can only imagine how El Pais would have responded if anyone had done anything remotely similar for the inauguration of a Latin American president, someone who people had actually voted for instance. In its attachment to the monarchy and to the 1978 Constitution, El Pais may look like it's staying true to its founding principles of support for democracy. But its development over the years and the ideological slant of its coverage, especially when it comes to Latin America, suggests that its main loyalty has been to the procedures of democracy rather than the substance. And where that substance comes into conflict with the private interests of its owners and masters, the paper knows which side it's really on. It remains a powerful and influential presence in the Spanish language media landscape. Yet, as crisis continues to rack Spain and the corrosion and inadequacies of the post-Franco model become increasingly apparent, El Pais risks becoming the mouthpiece of an increasingly hollow consensus.